blood, brotherhood, and a secret that could get her killed. She thought she'd escaped the outlaw life, falling for a rugged biker who promised her safety. But when he took off his shirt in the dim motel light, the ink on his skin proved she was sleeping with the very nightmare she ran from. The Nevada sun didn't just beat down on the town of Tonopah. It baked it into a state of permanent exhaustion. The heat radiating off Highway 95 was visible in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon and making the distant mountains look like a mirage. Inside the Rusty Spur diner, the swamp cooler rattled aggressively, doing little more than pushing around the scent of old grease, stale coffee, and bleached countertops. For 26-year-old Abby Lawson, the oppressive heat was a comfort. It kept people irritable, tired, and moving fast. More importantly, it kept them from looking too closely at the waitress refilling their mugs. Abby had been a ghost for 9 years. She didn't exist on social media, she didn't have a credit card, and she certainly didn't use her real name. The birth certificate, hidden in the lining of her cheap duffel bag back at her trailer, read Abigail Trenton. But Abigail Trenton had died the night her father, Arthur Grit Trenton, a notorious enforcer for the Hells Angels motorcycle club, was dragged out of their California home in handcuffs. He went down for a brutal string of federal racketeering charges and a high-profile murder tied to a turf war. Abigail had been the state's star witness, though her identity was fiercely protected. She was the one who handed the DEA the ledgers. She was the one who betrayed the club. In the outlaw world, rats don't get second chances. They get shallow graves in the Mojave. So she became Abby Lawson, a quiet, unassuming girl with dyed black hair, cheap thrift store clothes, and a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. She poured coffee, saved her tips, and kept her head down. Until the afternoon, Wyatt walked in. Abby heard him before she saw him. The guttural, thunderous roar of a Harley-Davidson knucklehead engine shook the diner's plate glass windows. It was a sound that instantly made Abby's stomach drop. To a civilian, it was just a loud motorcycle. To Abby, it was the sound of her childhood. It was the sound of terrifying men gathering in her living room, of cigarette smoke, blood-stained leather, and whispered threats. She froze mid-pour, the diner's cheap glass coffee pot trembling in her hand. She watched the front door swing open. Her was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a predatory grace that immediately commanded the room. He wore heavy denim, scuffed engineer boots, and a sun-faded black leather vest. And there it was, stitched proudly onto the back of the leather. The winged death's head. The iconic red and white patches. The top rocker read Hells Angels. The bottom rocker read Oakland. The motherland. The 1%er diamond patch sat squarely on his chest, a brazen declaration that he lived entirely outside the laws of polite society. Panic seized Abby's throat. Did they find me? Did my father send him? She instinctively took a step back toward the kitchen doors, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But the biker didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even look around, with the scrutinizing gaze of a hitman. He just looked exhausted. He ran a grease-stained hand through messy, sweat-dampened, sandy blonde hair, took off his dark sunglasses, and slumped into a corner booth. "Hey, Leah," the fry cook called out from the back, using her fake name. "Table 4 needs a menu." Abby swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed a plastic-coated menu. Act normal. be a ghost. He doesn't know you. You were a teenager when you left. She walked over to the booth, keeping her eyes focused firmly on the scarred Formica table. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice tight but steady. The biker looked up at her. His eyes were a startling, piercing steel blue. They were hard eyes, eyes that had seen violence. But right now, they were just weary. "Black," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "And whatever pie is fresh. If none of it's fresh, just the coffee." "Cherries from this morning," she lied smoothly. "Cherry it is." When she returned with the mug and the pie, she noticed his hands. His knuckles were heavily tattooed, but they were also busted and bruised. There was a thin, fresh cut along his jawline. He caught her looking. "Blown head gasket," he said, offering a faint, crooked smile. "And a disagreement with a crowbar in Bakersfield. Bike's at the local shop down the street. Mechanic says it'll take a week to get the parts out here." Abby didn't ask which part of that explanation caused the bruised knuckles. She didn't want to know. "A week in Tonopah is a long time," she murmured, immediately regretting engaging him in conversation. "I've got nowhere to be," he replied, taking a slow sip of the scalding coffee. "I'm Wyatt." "Leah," she lied, the name slipping out easily. Over the next 7 days, Wyatt became a fixture at the Rusty Spur. He came in every afternoon, always sitting in the same corner booth, always ordering black coffee and whatever pie she recommended. Despite every survival instinct screaming at Abby to quit her job, pack her duffel bag, and catch a greyhound to Canada, she found herself staying. Wyatt was a contradiction. He wore the patch of a ruthless syndicate, a club her father had killed for. Yet he was quiet, observant, and strangely polite to her. He didn't catcall her like the rig workers did. He didn't leave cheap tips. He left crisp $20 bills and engaged her in quiet conversations when the diner emptied out. He told her he was taking a breather from the Bay Area, running the desert highways just to clear his head. She told him she was from a foster home in Oregon, just drifting through Nevada until she saved enough money to open a bakery. They were two drifters exchanging carefully constructed fictions, but the underlying loneliness in both of them was raw and real. Abby knew she was playing with fire. The Hells Angels weren't just a club. They were an intelligence network. If Wyatt happened to mention a girl named Leah with dark hair and a scar on her chin to the wrong brother, the puzzle pieces could connect back to Arthur Trenton's missing rat of a daughter. But loneliness is a powerful drug. For 9 years, Abby had denied herself any real human connection. She had no friends, no lovers, no confidants. When Wyatt looked at her with those steel blue eyes, it felt like the first time she had truly been seen in a decade. On the 8th day, the mechanic finished Wyatt's knucklehead. Wyatt came into the diner right before her shift ended. The engine rumbled ominously in the parking lot. "I'm heading south tomorrow morning," Wyatt said, leaning against the counter. He didn't look at her with his usual relaxed demeanor. There was an intensity there now. "Come for a ride with me tonight, Leah. Let me show you the desert. Desert when it's not trying to cook you alive." Every alarm bell in her brain rang in unison. "No. Step away. Run." "Okay," she whispered. The ride into the Nevada desert was intoxicating. Sitting behind Wyatt on the heavy, vibrating machine, her arms wrapped tightly around his leather vest, Abby felt a dangerous wave of nostalgia. The smell of hot engine oil, the wind roaring in her ears, the sheer, unapologetic power of the bike. It was a sensory overload that bypassed her fear and hit straight at her adrenaline. Wyatt drove them 40 miles out of town, pulling off the highway onto a desolate, hard-packed dirt ridge that overlooked a vast, sweeping valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of bruised purple, blood red, and burnt orange. They sat on a boulder, passing a lukewarm beer between them, watching the stars begin to pierce the darkening sky. "You don't talk much about your family," Wyatt noted casually, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Abby's grip on the glass bottle tightened. "Not much to talk about. The system raised me. I learned early on that relying on blood is a good way to get disappointed." Wyatt turned his head, looking at her intently. "I get that. Where I come from, the family you choose is the only one that matters. Blood is just an accident of birth. Brotherhood is a choice." "Does your brotherhood demand a lot?" she asked, immediately biting her tongue. She knew exactly what they demanded. Absolute, unwavering, terrifying loyalty. Wyatt smirked, a dangerous, thrilling expression. "It demands everything, but it gives back exactly what you put into it. Protection, respect, a purpose." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I know you're running from something, Leah. I can see it in how you watch the door at the diner, how you flinch when a siren goes off down the highway." Abby's breath hitched. "I'm not running." Wyatt reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. "It's okay if you are. Out here, everyone is running from something. But you don't have to run from me." He kissed her then. It wasn't the gentle, hesitant kiss of a boy. It was demanding, consuming, and pulled at a dark, broken part of her soul that she had tried to bury. She kissed him back fiercely, desperately, letting the lie consume her completely. For just one night, she didn't want to be the rat. She didn't want to be Arthur Trenton's daughter. She just wanted to be a girl in the desert with a beautiful, dangerous man. They didn't go back to her rusty trailer. They went to Wyatt's room at the infamous Clown Motel in Tonopah. The neon sign buzzed erratically outside the window, casting a sick, intermittent red glow into the cheap, wood-paneled room. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke, cheap aftershave, and ozone. The heat between them was frantic. The lies they had told each other didn't matter in the dark. As they fell onto the lumpy mattress, Abby's hands roamed over Wyatt's shoulders, feeling the thick, raised scars and the smooth texture of heavy tattoo ink beneath his skin. She knew the standard club tattoos. As Wyatt pulled his t-shirt over his head and tossed it aside, she saw the AFFA inked over his heart. She saw the number 81 on his bicep, the 8th and 1st letters of the alphabet, HA. She saw the smaller death's head on his forearm. She feigned ignorance, touching them lightly, playing the part of the naive civilian girl mesmerized by the bad boy. Wyatt was gentle, his rough hands surprisingly tender as they traced the curve of her waist. For an hour, in the suffocating heat of the desert motel, Abby felt genuinely safe. It was a stupid, reckless illusion, but she clung to it. Afterward, Wyatt rolled over and swung his legs off the bed. "I need a smoke," he muttered, his voice raspy. Abby lay back against the pillows, the sheets pulled up to her chest, watching his back as he reached for the pack of Marlboros on the cheap laminate nightstand. The neon light outside flickered, casting a sharp, red illumination across his broad, muscular back. And that was when her heart stopped beating. Abby froze. The air in her lungs turned to ice. She forgot how to breathe. There, covering Wyatt's right shoulder blade, was a massive, intricately detailed custom tattoo. It was mostly hidden when he wore his cut, but here, bare-chested, it dominated his skin. It was a grinning skull, wearing a shattered, spiked crown. Clutched in the skull's skeletal teeth was a bloody ace of spades. Wrapped around the base of the skull was a heavy iron chain, meticulously drawn with exactly 5 broken links. Beneath it, a Gothic script banner read, San Gabriel, 08, no forgiveness. Abby stared at it, her vision blurring, a high-pitched ringing echoing in her ears. She knew that tattoo. She knew every single line of it, every shadow, every drop of ink. She had seen it being drawn on a piece of grease-stained napkin on her kitchen table when she was 15 years old. Her father, Arthur Grit Trenton, had designed it himself. It wasn't an official club patch. It was a blood-packed tattoo. A private, highly restricted piece of ink worn by only 5 men. In 2008, the Oakland and San Bernardino chapters had gone to war with the Mongols Motorcycle Club over a drug territory dispute in the San Gabriel Valley. It was a bloodbath. Dozens of men died. Arthur Trenton and his 4 most trusted enforcers had been trapped in a warehouse for 3 days, fighting off wave after wave of rival members. When they finally walked out alive, Arthur declared that the 5 of them were bound by something thicker than blood. He designed the shattered crown tattoo. Only those 5 men were allowed to wear it. Anyone else caught with it would have it removed with a blowtorch. Wyatt was in his early 30s. In 2008, he would have been a teenager, nowhere near a fully patched member, let alone part of Arthur Trenton's elite hit squad. There was only one way Wyatt had that tattoo. He didn't earn it in 1999. He inherited it. He was a legacy. He was connected directly to one of the 5 men her father trusted most. Maybe he was the son of one of them. Or maybe he was Arthur's new protégé, groomed inside the prison walls. Wyatt struck a match, the sulfur scent filling the room as he lit his cigarette. He inhaled deeply, the cherry glowing bright red, before exhaling a thick plume of smoke toward the ceiling. He didn't turn around. "You're quiet," Wyatt noted softly. Abby's mouth was bone dry. She tried to swallow, but her throat refused to work. She slowly pulled the motel sheet tighter around her trembling body, measuring the distance to the door, calculating if she had enough time to grab her jeans and run before he could cross the room. "I was just looking at your tattoos," Abby managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. She forced herself to sound casually curious, masking the sheer, unadulterated terror threatening to rip her apart. "The one on your back. The skull with the crown. I've never seen one like that before." Wyatt paused. The hand holding the cigarette hovered in the air. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. The neon light caught his steel blue eyes, and the warmth that had been there 10 minutes ago was completely gone. They were flat, cold, and predatory. He turned his body fully toward her, sitting on the edge of the bed. He took another drag of the cigarette, the smoke curling around his face like a shroud. "You like it?" he asked. The gravel in his voice had hardened into stone. "It's intense," she stammers, fighting the urge to scramble backward against the headboard. "What does the crown mean? And the date?" Wyatt leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, staring directly into her soul. It means someone tried to take down a king, and we're still hunting the rat who sold him out." Abby's blood ran completely cold. "The thing about rats," Wyatt continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper, "is that they think they can hide. They change their names. They dye their hair. They run off to the desert and pour coffee, thinking the club has a short memory." He flicked ash onto the carpet, his eyes never leaving hers. "But the club never forgets, and neither does Grit." He knew. "I didn't stumble into the Rusty Spur diner by accident. The blown head gasket, the quiet conversations, the gentle touches. It was all a trap. Wyatt had tracked her down. The Hells Angels had finally found Abigail Trenton. Wyatt reached over to the nightstand, his hand sliding past his pack of cigarettes to the heavy metal object resting in the shadows. When he brought his hand back, the neon light glinted off the barrel of a customized 1911 pistol. "Hello, Abigail," he whispered. The heavy steel of the 1911 pistol gleamed under the erratic red flash of the motel's neon sign. Abby stared down the barrel, her mind completely blanking, stripped of every lie she had carefully constructed for the last 9 years. The ghost of Abigail Trenton had finally been dragged back into the land of the living, and it was going to get her killed. She didn't scream. Screaming in a place like the Clown Motel in Tonopah only annoyed the neighbors. Instead, her survival instincts kicked in. Her hand gripped the edge of the cheap mattress, her muscles coiling as she calculated the distance to the bathroom door. "Don't do it, Abby," Wyatt warned, reading her body language instantly. His voice was dead calm, devoid of the passion they had shared just moments before. "You won't make it to the tiles. Sit still." Abby pulled the thin sheet up to her collarbone, her chest heaving. "Are you going to shoot me right here? Make a mess for the maid?" Wyatt slowly lowered the gun, though he didn't uncock it. He rested the heavy barrel against his thigh, the red cherry of his cigarette burning down toward his knuckles. "If I wanted to put a bullet in your head, I would have done it on that ridge 2 hours ago. It would have been easier to bury you in the desert. Nobody digs in the Mojave." "Then what do you want?" she spat, the terror morphing into a desperate, cornered anger. "Did my father send you? Did Grit finally decide the witness protection program wasn't good enough?" Wyatt let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "Your old man is rotting in ADX Florence, Abby. He's got 23 hours a day in a concrete box. He's not pulling strings anymore." Wyatt took a final drag of his cigarette and crushed it into the cheap glass ashtray. "My name is Wyatt Sullivan. My father was Declan Sullivan." The name hit Abby like a physical blow. Declan Sullivan. He was one of the 5. He was the youngest of Grit Trenton's inner circle, a fierce loyalist who had practically lived on their living room couch when Abby was a teenager. "Declan was arrested 3 days after you handed those ledgers to the DEA," Wyatt continued, his steel blue eyes locking onto hers, burning with a cold fire. "He got 50 years in San Quentin, but he didn't even make it 3. A prison riot, a shank to the kidneys. He bled out on the rec yard floor." Abby squeezed her eyes shut, a tear hot and sharp escaping down her cheek. "I didn't want him to die. I wanted out. I wanted it all to stop. The violence, the feds sitting outside my high school. My dad rode with Sonny back in the golden days of the Oakland Charter. Wyatt. He was untouchable, and he thought he was a god. But he was just a murderer. I had to stop him." Wyatt's jaw tightened at the mention of the legendary club founder. Barga's shadow still loomed large over the angels, setting the gold standard for brotherhood and brutality. "I know what your father was," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But here's the problem, Abby. The DEA didn't just use your testimony to lock up Grit. The feds doctored those ledgers. They used your signature to frame my father for a heroin trafficking ring he wasn't part of. Declan was an enforcer, sure, but he drew the line at smack. The feds needed a clean sweep, so they forged the documents you authenticated." Abby opened her eyes, staring at him in shock. "No. Agent Jenkins promised me." "Agent Jenkins is a dirty suit who used a scared 15-year-old girl to fast-track his promotion," Wyatt snarled. "And now, the Oakland Charter thinks my father was dealing behind the club's back. They stripped his patches post-mortem. They disgraced his name. My family has been treated like rat blood for a decade." Wyatt leaned forward, the gun now fully lowered. "I spent 5 years tracking you down, Abby. I hacked DMV records, I paid off rogue federal clerks, and I traced a single facial recognition ping from a traffic camera in Reno 6 months ago. I didn't come to kill the rat. I came to clear my father's name. I need you to testify again. I need you to go on the record and admit Jenkins fed you forged pages." "Are you insane?" Abby hissed, dropping the sheet slightly in her outrage. "If I resurface, the club will slaughter me. Oakland doesn't care about a corrupted DEA file. They care that I put their top enforcer in a supermax. You owe me a life," Wyatt roared, the sudden volume making Abby flinch. He instantly caught himself, gripping the bridge of his nose, his knuckles turning white. "You owe me, Abby. You took my father. Now you're going to help me get his legacy back." Before Abby could respond, the unmistakable crunch of gravel outside the motel room window shattered the tense silence. Wyatt froze. The predatory instincts returned in a split second. He smoothly raised the 1911, clicking the safety off. "Get on the floor," he ordered, his voice a lethal hiss. "What?" "Floor, now!" Abby threw herself off the mattress, hitting the stained carpet just as the cheap plywood door exploded inward. Splinters rained over the bed like shrapnel. 2 men rushed the doorway, clad in dark Kevlar vests and tactical masks. The metallic crack of a suppressed weapon hissed through the room, and the motel's television shattered into a shower of sparks and black glass. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He fired blindly through the darkness, the massive boom of his .45 caliber 1911 deafening in the tight space. The first intruder caught a round in the shoulder, spinning backward into the neon-lit parking lot with a choked grunt. "Oakland sent a cleanup crew," Wyatt yelled over the ringing in Abby's ears. "They must have followed my digital trail to Reno. They know you're alive." He fired twice more, suppressing the second gunman who tried to pie the corner of the door frame. Plaster dust choked the dry air. "Boots, move!" Wyatt barked. Abby scrambled on her hands and knees, grabbing her faded denim jacket and yanking it over her bare chest. Bullets chewed through the thin walls as Wyatt grabbed her arm, hauling her toward the back of the room. He slammed his heavy boot into the frosted glass of the bathroom window, shattering it instantly. "Go!" He shoved her upward. Abby scrambled through the jagged frame, tearing her jeans and slicing her palm on a shard of glass, tumbling out into the dirt alley behind the motel. A second later, Wyatt vaulted through, landing gracefully beside her. "To the bike," he commanded, pulling her to her feet. Wyatt's knucklehead was parked in the shadows near the ice machine. He kicked the heavy engine to life. the roar splitting the quiet Tonopah night like a thunderclap. Abby leapt onto the back pillion, wrapping her arms around his waist with a vice-like grip, burying her face into his scarred back. The motorcycle tore out of the lot, kicking up a violent spray of gravel just as the masked men burst into the alley, raising their weapons. But Wyatt was already shifting gears, hurtling down the pitch-black stretch of Highway 95. They rode for hours, the adrenaline slowly bleeding out of Abby, replaced by the freezing desert wind. Dawn was breaking when Wyatt finally pulled onto a scenic overlook near the California border. The sky bled gold and pink over the jagged mountains. Wyatt killed the engine and swung his leg over the bike, looking exhausted and entirely uncompromising. He reached into his leather cut, pulling out a thick manila envelope and a prepaid burner phone, shoving them into her chest. "Cash, $5,000, and the phone has one number," Wyatt said, his steel blue eyes devoid of the warmth they had shared. "It's a journalist in Los Angeles investigating Agent Jenkins. Call him. Give him the true story. Clear Declan Sullivan's name." Abby stared at the envelope. "And if I just run?" "If you run, those men will find you," Wyatt replied softly. "Do this, and the feds will have to place you in a new, airtight program. To save their pair, you get a new life, and my father rests in peace." He turned back to his Harley, throwing his leg over the saddle. "Wyatt," she called out, "back at the motel. Was any of it real?" Wyatt paused, the Nevada wind whipping his sandy blonde hair. "We're both ghosts, Leah, and ghosts don't get to have real lives." He kicked the engine over, the roar swallowing her reply, and tore off down the highway. Abby stood alone in the desert dawn. She had survived the Hells Angels twice. Now, she just had to survive the truth. If this gritty tale of betrayal, brotherhood, and survival kept you on the edge of your seat, you won't want to miss what we have coming next. The criminal underworld is full of dark secrets and shattered loyalties, and we are dedicated to bringing you the most intense, realistic stories on the internet. Hit that like button, share this story with your friends who love a thrilling ride, and subscribe to our channel for more pulse-pounding, high-octane narratives every single week. Stay wild and stay safe. Snow was falling, but the children at St. Jude's weren't looking at the sky. They were staring at a smoldering pile of ash that used to be their Christmas. Someone had burned their gifts to the ground. They thought they had won. Then the Hells Angels made a phone call. The winter of 1998 hit the Rust Belt town of Oak Haven with a brutality that chilled the bones. The factories had mostly closed, the streets were lined with graying snow, and hope was a commodity in shorter supply than heating oil. But inside the walls of St. Jude's Home for Children, there was a warmth that the biting wind couldn't touch. Director Thomas Callahan, a man whose deeply lined face told the story of 30 years spent fighting for forgotten kids, had pulled off a miracle. St. Jude's was chronically underfunded. The radiators hissed and banged, the roof leaked in the spring, and the state board was constantly threatening to shut them down. Yet, for the past 3 months, Thomas had tirelessly campaigned on local radio stations, stood outside grocery stores, and knocked on the doors of local businesses. He had organized the biggest toy drive in the county's history. By December 22nd, the detached, aluminum-sided gymnasium at the back of the orphanage property was packed to the rafters. There were shiny red Schwinn bicycles lined up like soldiers, mountains of wrapped boxes, porcelain dolls, remote-controlled cars, and most importantly, heavy winter coats for all 42 children living in the home. For 7-year-old Lily, who had arrived at St. Jude's in October, clutching a torn garbage bag holding all her worldly possessions. The promise of Christmas was overwhelming. She had never received a wrapped present in her life. Thomas had caught her peeking through the frosted windows of the gymnasium the night before, her breath pluming in the freezing air, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated joy. "They're for you, Lily," Thomas had whispered, resting a heavy, reassuring hand on her small shoulder. "All of them. For you and the others. Santa didn't forget you." But monsters don't care about Christmas. It happened at 2:14 a.m. on December 23rd. The fire alarm inside the main house shrieked to life, jolting Thomas from his sleep. He threw on his boots, not even bothering with a coat, and bolted into the hallway. The children were already spilling out of their rooms, terrified, clutching thin blankets. But the fire wasn't in the main house. The orange glow bleeding through the windows was coming from the backyard. The gymnasium was an inferno. The flames roared into the pitch-black sky, a swirling vortex of heat and destruction. By the time the local fire department sirens wailed in the distance, the roof of the gym had already collapsed in a shower of sparks. Thomas stood in the knee-deep snow, holding little Lily tightly against his chest to shield her from the searing heat, tears freezing on his cheeks. He watched helplessly as the bicycles melted, as the coats turned to ash, as the mountain of dreams he had built for these children was reduced to a blackened, smoking crater. Morning broke over Oak Haven with a cruel grey light. The smoke still hung heavy in the air, carrying the sickening toxic smell of burned plastic and scorched rubber. Fire Chief Miller stood by the ruins, his face grim, turning a charred metallic object over in his thick gloves. He walked over to where Thomas was sitting on the back steps of the main house, his head in his hands. "Thomas," the chief said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I need you to look at this." He held out the object. It was the melted remains of a heavy-duty master padlock. "It was cut," the chief explained. "Bolt cutters. And that's not all. My boys found the remnants of 2 steel gasoline canisters in the brush by the fence line. This wasn't faulty wiring, Thomas. This was intentional. Someone torched this place on purpose." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow to the stomach. Who? Who would burn the Christmas gifts of orphans? The terrible realization began to dawn on him. For months, a predatory real estate developer named Richard Kincaid had been aggressively trying to buy the land St. Jude sat on. Kincaid Enterprises was planning a massive luxury condominium development, and the orphanage was the last holdout blocking the project. Kincaid had sent lawyers. He had sent eviction notices based on obscure zoning technicalities, and recently the threats had become less legal and more physical. Broken windows, vandalized transport vans. This fire wasn't just cruelty. It was a message. Leave, or the main house is next. By noon, the story had broken on the local news. The reporter stood in front of the blackened wreckage, her voice trembling as she described the utter devastation. The camera panned to the children, their faces pressed against the frosty glass of the dining room window, looking out at the ruins of their Christmas. Little Lily was shown holding a half-melted wheel of a toy truck she had found in the snow. The town of Oak Haven was outraged, but paralyzed. The police chief told Thomas they had no hard evidence tying Kincaid to the arson. The local thugs Kincaid used for his dirty work were ghosts, slipping back into the shadows of the city's underbelly. The community was heartbroken, but there was no time to rebuild. Christmas was 48 hours away. The orphanage was devastated, broken, and terrified. They thought Kincaid had won. They thought no one was coming to save them. They were wrong. 20 miles away, on the industrial outskirts of the city, A neon sign buzzed ominously in the daylight. The Iron Horse Saloon. Behind the heavy steel doors lay the fortified clubhouse of the local Hells Angels charter. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of stale beer, and the heavy scent of saddle leather. The men who occupied this space were not the type of people polite society invited to dinner. They were massive, heavily tattooed, clad in grease-stained denim and black leather cuts bearing the infamous Death's Head patch. They lived by their own code, entirely outside the bounds of traditional law and order. Bobby Jenkins, the president of the charter, sat at the head of the scarred wooden bar. Bobby was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4" with a wild, graying beard, arms the size of tree trunks, and a gaze that could make a state trooper nervously look away. He was sipping black coffee, quietly going over a ledger, while the small television mounted in the corner of the bar hummed with the midday news. Next to him sat his sergeant-at-arms, a man known simply as Bear, sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone, and Dutch, the charter's vice president, who was meticulously cleaning the spark plugs of his Harley-Davidson shovelhead. "Police are calling it a deliberate act of arson," the news anchor's voice cut through the low rumble of the clubhouse. Bobby paused, his pen hovering over the ledger. He slowly raised his head, his eyes locking onto the television screen. The camera showed the smoking ruins of the St. Jude's Gymnasium. It showed the melted toys. And then, it showed the faces of the children. It showed Thomas Callahan, a man broken, desperately trying to hold back tears as he explained that 42 orphans would wake up to absolutely nothing on Christmas morning. The clubhouse, usually a cacophony of loud laughter, clinking glasses, and heavy metal music, went dead silent. The grinding of Bear's whetstone stopped. Dutch lowered his wrench. Every man in the room was staring at the screen. In the outlaw biker world, there are lines you cross and lines you don't. You war with rival clubs, you fight the cops, you hustle to survive. But you never touch kids. To these men, many of whom had grown up in broken homes, foster care, or on the streets themselves, the abuse of a child was the ultimate, unforgivable sin. Bobby stared at the screen, a terrifying, quiet fury building behind his dark eyes. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He just calmly set his pen down on the bar. "Turn it up," Bobby commanded. His voice was dangerously low, a rumbling baritone that carried absolute authority. The bartender scrambled to crank the volume. The news report mentioned the suspected ties to local real estate intimidation, hinting at Richard Kincaid's name, though the reporter was careful not to make direct accusations without police evidence. The police spokesperson then came on, giving the standard bureaucratic line. "We are investigating all leads, but currently have no suspects in custody." Bobby picked up his flip phone. He flipped it open and dialed a single number. The silence in the bar was absolute. Everyone knew what was happening. When Bobby Jenkins made this specific call, the earth moved. "Yeah, it's Bobby," he spoke into the receiver, his voice ice cold. "You watching Channel 8? Good. Call the brothers, all of them. Get the prospects to warm up the bikes. We're locking down the city." He snapped the phone shut and turned to face his men. The air in the room crackled with a violent, focused energy. "Some suits and street rats think they can burn down an orphanage to make a buck," Bobby said, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of every hardened biker. "The cops are going to file paperwork. We are not. We find the matches. We break the hands." Within 30 minutes, the heavy steel doors of the clubhouse rolled open. A deafening, thundering roar echoed across the industrial park as 50 Harley-Davidsons roared to life. It was a mechanical symphony of wrath. They rode out in perfect formation, a heavy black leather cavalry cutting through the freezing snow. Their first stop wasn't the police station. It wasn't the orphanage. It was the streets. The Hells Angels didn't need warrants to get information. They knew the underbelly of the city better than the police ever could. Bobby dispatched his crew to every dive bar, every chop shop, and every illicit gambling den in Oakhaven. Bear and Dutch kicked in the door of a seedy pool hall in the South End, a known hangout for local muscle for hire. The music screeched to a halt. The patrons froze as the two massive bikers stepped into the dim light, the heavy chains on their boots clinking against the hardwood floor. Bear walked straight up to a low-level enforcer named Jimmy Farrell. Jimmy was a known associate of Richard Kincaid, the kind of guy who threw bricks through windows for a couple of $100. Jimmy took one look at Bear's face and tried to bolt for the back exit. He didn't make it 3 steps. Dutch grabbed Jimmy by the scruff of his jacket, lifting him entirely off the ground, and slammed him against the brick wall with a sickening thud. The pool hall remained completely silent. Nobody moved to help him. "Let's have a chat, Jimmy," Bear said casually, stepping into Jimmy's personal space, his shadow completely enveloping the terrified thug. "Word on the street is you've been doing some freelance work for a guy named Kincaid, handing out eviction notices with a lighter." "I don't know what you're talking about, man, I swear," Jimmy stammered, his eyes darting frantically. Bear didn't blink. He slowly reached into his leather cut and pulled out a Zippo lighter. He flipped it open with a sharp clack, the flame illuminating his scarred face. He held it an inch from Jimmy's nose. "You know what happens to rats who burn down kids' toys?" Bear whispered, the threat hanging in the air like poison. "They tend to catch fire themselves. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Who held the matches, Jimmy?" Jimmy broke. The terror of the police was one thing. The reality of the Hells Angels standing in front of him was entirely another. He spilled everything. It was a crew of 3 local guys. Kincaid had paid them $5,000 to torch the gym, to scare the director into selling. He even gave up the location where the arsonists were currently laying low, celebrating their payday, an abandoned warehouse near the docks. Bear snapped the Zippo shut. "Good boy." Within 10 minutes, the thunder returned. The pack of 50 motorcycles converged on the docks, the roar of their engines vibrating the icy pavement. They didn't knock. Bobby Jenkins drove his shovelhead straight through the rotting wooden doors of the warehouse, the front tire smashing the wood into splinters. The rest of the club poured in behind him, encircling the 3 thugs who had been sitting around a Swiss heater, counting Kincaid's cash. The men scrambled to their feet, reaching for weapons, but they were surrounded by a wall of leather, iron, and silent, seething fury. There was no escape. Bobby dismounted his bike, moving with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. He walked toward the ringleader, a wiry man with a rat-like face. Bobby looked down at the stacks of cash on the table, then back up to the trembling arsonist. "You like fire?" Bobby asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous warehouse. The man couldn't speak. He was hyperventilating, realizing that his life, as he knew it, was effectively over. "You burned the coats," Bobby continued, stepping closer, the scent of motor oil and cold wind rolling off him. "You burned the dolls. You took a little girl's Christmas, and you burned it to ash." Bobby's massive hand shot out, grabbing the man by the throat. He didn't squeeze to kill, but to assert absolute dominance. He dragged the man to his knees, forcing him to look at the Hells Angels surrounding him. "Here's the deal," Bobby said, looking down at the pathetic figures. "You're going to call your boss, Kincaid. You're going to tell him you got caught. And then we are going to have a little lesson in restitution." The twist of fate was brutal and swift. The Hells Angels didn't kill them. Death would have been too easy. They had a much more poetic punishment in mind, one that would solve St. Jude's problem permanently. But the night was far from over, and Bobby Jenkins still had 42 children who needed a Christmas miracle. And if Santa couldn't deliver it on a sleigh, the angels were going to deliver it on 2 wheels. The rat-faced arsonist, a low-level grifter named Greg, was weeping openly. He clutched the heavy brick of a cellular phone Bobby Jenkins had shoved into his chest. Surrounding him, 50 members of the Hells Angels stood in dead silence, the only sound the metallic clink of chains and the harsh winter wind howling outside the broken warehouse doors. "Dial him," Bobby ordered, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Put it on speaker." Trembling fingers punched in the numbers. The phone rang 3 times before a smooth, arrogant voice answered on the other end. "I told you not to call me on this line, Greg," Richard Kincaid snapped. "Is the job done or not?" Yeah, Mr. Kincaid," Greg stammered, his eyes darting to Bear, who was idly tapping a heavy steel wrench against his palm. "The orphanage gym is gone. Burned to the ground." "Good. That old fool Callahan will have no choice but to fold now," Kincaid chuckled, a sound that made Bobby's jaw clench so hard it ached. "Your final payment is in the drop box. Don't contact me again." Bobby reached out and pressed the end call button. He then held up a small black cassette recorder he had retrieved from his leather saddlebag, hitting the stop button. The red recording light blinked off. He had Kincaid's admission crystal clear on tape. "Bear, Dutch," Bobby said, turning to his lieutenants. "Take our 3 fire starters here downtown. Tie them to the flagpole out front of the precinct. Tape the rest of Kincaid's cash to their chests with a little note for Detective Harrison. Let the cops have their collar." "What about you, boss?" Dutch asked, a dangerous grin spreading across his face. "I'm going to pay a visit to a real estate developer," Bobby replied, pulling his leather gloves on tight. "It's time to talk about restitution." 45 minutes later, Richard Kincaid was sitting in his plush, mahogany-paneled office on the top floor of the Kincaid Enterprises building. He was pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch, celebrating what he believed was the final nail in the coffin for St. Jude's. He didn't hear the elevator ding. He didn't hear his 2 private security guards hit the marble floor of the lobby after being swiftly incapacitated by blunt force trauma. The heavy oak doors to his office suddenly shattered inward, the wood splintering off the hinges. Kincaid dropped his crystal tumbler, the scotch staining his expensive Persian rug. Standing in the doorway were Bobby Jenkins, flanked by 4 of the largest, most intimidating men Kincaid had ever seen. They smelled of exhaust, cold air, and violence. "What is the meaning of this?" Kincaid shouted, scrambling backward behind his massive desk. "I'm calling the police!" Bobby walked slowly across the room, ignoring the threat entirely. He reached Kincaid's desk, swept a very expensive computer monitor off the edge with the back of his hand, and leaned in close. "You can call the cops, Richard," Bobby said quietly, placing the small cassette recorder on the polished wood. He hit play. Kincaid's own voice filled the room, confirming the arson. Kincaid went pale. The arrogance instantly drained from his face, replaced by naked, suffocating terror. He knew who the Hells Angels were. Everyone in Oakhaven did. He knew that his expensive lawyers couldn't protect him from the men standing in this room. "You're going to jail, Richard." "That's a given," Bobby stated, his eyes boring into Kincaid's soul. "The cops have your boys, and soon they'll have this tape. But how you spend your time before the cops get here, and whether you ever walk with both legs again, depends entirely on what happens in the next 3 minutes. What do you want?" Kincaid whispered, trembling violently. Bobby pulled a crumbled piece of paper from his pocket. I have a very specific list of demands. First, you will sign over the deed to the property adjacent to St. Jude's, dropping all claims and eviction notices, permanently transferring it to Thomas Callahan's name. Second, you will write a cashier's check for $300,000 for the emotional distress and structural damage you caused. Third, you will hand over $50,000 in untraceable cash from your personal safe, right here, right now. $350,000? Kincaid sputtered, his greed momentarily overriding his fear. That's extortion! Bear took half a step forward, his hand resting on the large hunting knife strapped to his thigh. No, Richard, Bobby corrected softly. Extortion is a crime. This is a charitable donation, and the clock is ticking. Faced with the literal monsters he had unwittingly invited into his life, Kincaid broke. With shaking hands, he opened his floor safe, stacking banded bundles of cash onto the desk. He called his bewildered lawyer to draft an emergency transfer of the deed, and he wrote the check. Bobby scooped the cash into a duffel bag and took the paperwork. He looked down at the ruined, terrified billionaire. "Merry Christmas, Richard," Bobby said. "Don't ever look at an orphanage again." The afternoon of December 24th was a surreal sight in downtown Oakhaven. Arthur Pendleton, the manager of the local Wonderland Toys, was preparing to lock up early for Christmas Eve when the roar of engines shook his front windows. He watched in absolute bewilderment as a convoy of 50 Harley-Davidsons took over his parking lot. Heavy-set men in leather cuts piled into the store. They didn't look at price tags. They didn't browse. "We need 50 winter coats, the heavy-duty ones," Dutch barked at a terrified teenage clerk. "And 20 of those shiny red bicycles. Load 'em in the truck outside." Bobby stood at the register with the duffel bag, tossing stacks of Kincaid's $100 bills onto the counter. They bought remote-controlled trucks, porcelain dolls, train sets, and enough wrapping paper to cover a house. The bikers formed an assembly line, wrapping presents with surprisingly gentle hands in the back of the toy store, their gruff voices debating over which ribbon looked best on a Barbie dream house. By nightfall, they had rented 3 massive box trucks, filling them to the brim. The operation was executed with military precision. The angels were going to war against despair, and they intended to win. Christmas morning broke over St. Jude's with a bitter, hollow silence. Inside the main dining hall, the 42 children sat at the long wooden tables. There was no running, no laughing, no tearing of paper. Thomas Callahan stood at the head of the room, serving bowls of plain oatmeal. He looked 10 years older than he had 2 days ago. He had tried to put on a brave face, stringing up a few paper chains. But the devastation in the children's eyes was too much to bear. Little Lily sat stirring her oatmeal, looking out the frosted window toward the blackened remains of the gymnasium. "It's okay, Mr. Thomas," Lily said softly, her small voice cutting through the quiet room. "Santa was probably just busy this year." Thomas swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I'm so sorry, Lily. I'm so sorry." Suddenly the floorboards began to vibrate. It started as a low rumble, barely perceptible, like a distant earthquake. Then it grew louder. The glasses on the tables began to clatter. The rattling of the radiator was drowned out by a deafening, mechanical roar. Thomas rushed to the window, his heart in his throat. He thought Kincaid had sent bulldozers, but as he looked out at the snow-covered driveway, his breath caught in his lungs. Leading the pack was a massive black Harley-Davidson, its handlebars wrapped in tinsel, a giant red wreath strapped to the front headlight. Behind it rode 49 more motorcycles, roaring in a V formation, kicking up clouds of white snow. Trailing the thundering pack were 3 large delivery trucks. The children rushed to the windows, their eyes wide with awe as the intimidating cavalry parked in a semicircle around the front lawn. Bobby Jenkins kicked down his kickstand and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with anticipation. He unstrapped a massive, brightly wrapped box from his bike and walked toward the front doors of the orphanage. The rest of the club followed, pulling open the backs of the trucks. Thomas cautiously opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Thomas asked, entirely unsure of what was happening. Bobby walked up the steps, his imposing frame dwarfing the director. He reached into his leather cut and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He pressed it into Thomas's trembling hands. "What is this?" Thomas asked. "Inside, you'll find the deed to the land this place sits on, signed over to you. Free and clear." "Kincaid is out of the picture," Bobby said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "There's also a cashier's check for 300 grand. Build a new gym. Build a better one." Thomas stared at the documents, his knees nearly giving out. I don't understand." "Who are you?" "We're just the delivery boys," Bobby replied. He looked past Thomas, spotting little Lily standing tentatively in the doorway. Bobby dropped down to one knee, the leather of his pants creaking. He held out the massive wrapped box toward the little girl. "I hear a bunch of jerks tried to ruin your Christmas," Bobby said, offering a soft smile that didn't quite match his scarred face. "Santa caught wind of it. He asked us to bring the backups. Is your name Lily?" Lily nodded slowly, her eyes darting from the giant man to the enormous box. "This one has your name on it, kid," Bobby said. Lily reached out and tore a piece of the paper away. Underneath was the edge of a brand-new porcelain doll, the exact one that had been destroyed in the fire. A brilliant, blinding smile broke across her face. Behind Bobby, the Hells Angels began unloading the trucks. Burly, tattooed men carried shiny red bicycles, massive stuffed bears, and heavy winter coats into the dining hall. The orphanage exploded into cheers, laughter, and the chaotic joy of tearing wrapping paper. Bear, a man who had terrified hardened criminals just 24 hours prior, was sitting on the floor, helping a 5-year-old boy put batteries into a remote-controlled car. Dutch was adjusting the helmet on a little girl as she tested out her new bike in the hallway. Thomas Callahan stood on the porch, weeping openly, watching the men society feared most perform a miracle society had failed to provide. The Hells Angels didn't stay for accolades. Once the trucks were empty and every child had a coat and a mountain of toys, Bobby rallied his men. They mounted their iron steeds, the engines roaring back to life, shattering the quiet winter morning once more. As they rode out of the gates, little Lily stood on the porch, clutching her new doll tight against her chest. She waved her small hand at the departing convoy. Bobby Jenkins threw a peace sign over his shoulder before disappearing into the snowy horizon. They were outlaws, criminals in the eyes of the law, and ghosts to polite society. But on that freezing Christmas morning in Oakhaven, they were the closest thing to angels those children would ever see. Sometimes, the greatest protectors don't wear capes. They wear leather and ride on 2 wheels. The Hells Angels proved that while justice might be blind, vengeance for the innocent has a roaring engine. If this incredible story of unlikely heroes and a real-life Christmas miracle moved you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that good still exists, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable, true-to-life stories.